This is a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online, the online resource for all construction professionals that's available 24/7. Please don't forget to subscribe at the place you usually get your podcasts so as not to miss a thing from this second series, as well as visiting our YouTube channel. Hello again and welcome to another podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. As usual, Barney, my red Labrador, is here to offer advice and to keep an eye on proceedings. And by the way, Barney and I would really appreciate it if you would like to write a review. If you're new to Duncan Cartlidge Online podcasts, welcome. Please don't forget to subscribe, as well as catching up with the previous episodes. If you're already a subscriber, thank you for your support. In this packed episode, we cover a wide range of topics, including the credibility of construction estimates, dumbing down apprenticeships, what price construction safety, measuring embodied carbon, and finally, moths and the new RICS precedent. We'll start off with some good news. This morning, for the first time in months, when I took Barney out for his early morning walk, the birds were singing and the sun was rising. So, perhaps the end of the winter is in sight. But let's get on with the podcast. The first topic, trusting the figures, snake oil estimates. This week I was reminded of a book written a few years ago by the Danish professor Bent Fladberg, entitled Mega Projects and Risk. In the book, Bent and his colleagues concluded that, by analysing a range of mega infrastructure projects, the impact of risk and rising costs of large mega projects has been largely ignored by promoters and politicians in order to get approval to go ahead. Furthermore, that in their quest, promoters were aided and abetted by their professional advisors, of which quantity surveyors played a major role. Fladberg et al., and incidentally, the book is still available, went further by suggesting the unthinkable, namely that those responsible for being economic with the costs should be imprisoned. Now, this suggestion is very opportune, as last week the details of the new Barlinnie prison in Glasgow, Scotland, were revealed. In 2022, the cost of the replacement Barlinnie prison was estimated at 400 million, but it was reported in the Scottish press last week that the latest estimates had risen to, wait for it, £999 million. Now, given the size and complexity of this project, who in their right minds comes up with an estimate of £999 million? I'm surprised they didn't add the odd 46p in. Perhaps Ben's got something. Incidentally, for those of you who use the unit approach to approximate estimating, that's £740,000 per inmate. The blame for the increase was put on, now wait for it, Brexit, COVID, and the war in Ukraine. Really? Some unconvincing statistics were included in a letter to Scotland's Public Audit Committee, claiming the increase on costs can be put down to building materials having risen by 40% between 2020 and 2025, even though the Office for National Statistics put the increase substantially lower than that. The prison will also be delivered 8 years later than planned. The main design and construct contract, Kier, has only recently signed up to the deal, so we can perhaps expect more increases and delays as the work progresses. John Swinney, the Scottish First Minister, is on record as stating that there is a rigorous process of getting value for money for taxpayers. Who's kidding who? I try to keep politics out of podcasts, but there have been several suggestions that the blame is largely down to the ineptitude of the Scottish Government. Moving quickly on, This is another nail in the coffin for the reputation of construction industry and its ability to accurately predict the cost of projects. Now, not unsurprisingly, the Red Top Papers in Scotland jumped on the cost of the new prison and dumped it as a 5-star super prison resort. No wonder people regard construction estimates as no more useful than snake oil. Incidentally, for those who haven't heard of the term snake oil, it's widely defined as a symbol of fraud and deception. Now, before moving on, and sorry to keep banging on about skills shortages, but it's never far from the headlines. The government has announced that 12 new towns are going to be built by British workers. I don't know what to say, really. In addition, apprenticeships are proposed to be reduced from 12 to 8 months, and the basic requirements for English and maths skills are to be watered down. The CIOB seems to be alone in voicing worries about this move. While changes are welcomed, there is concern that this dumbing down will result in even lower levels of skills at the time when many new build schemes have been criticised for poor workmanship. You know the old maxim, rubbish in, rubbish out. It's anticipated this initiative will result in an additional 10,000 a year more apprenticeships across all sectors. Given construction alone needs 250,000 additional skilled operatives by 2028, and that's only 3 years away, well, you do the math. This comes at a time when we still wait for the RICS to publish the outcome of its consultation into surveying education and training pathways. More on this when we have it. And, as a footnote, the Managing Director of Turner & Townsend has recently called for, and I quote, a ready supply of digitally savvy, carbon-conscious cost managers and project managers. Amen to that. In the last podcast, I discussed some of the detail of one of the most important pieces of legislation to affect the construction industry in years, the Building Safety Act. I described a developing situation around the Building Safety Regulator insisting that all work would not be able to start on site until all the key elements of the design had been completed, approved and passed through Gateway 2, and how this can have major implications on single-stage design and construct contracts. This is bad timing for the government, as their ambitious build baby build housing targets are already looking out of reach. Well, since the last podcast, it really has kicked off, with several contractors complaining, with some justification, about the time it's taking to get the HRB project signed off. The target time is 12 weeks, but in practice the average time is 22 weeks, with some projects taking as long as 31 weeks. Surprisingly, the Building Safety Regulator does not directly employ the technical staff needed to consider new projects, but instead relies on outsourcing applications to multidisciplinary design teams, which, given the lack of spare capacity in the market, is proving to be problematic. In an interview with Building Magazine, the Building Safety Regulator admitted it can take up to a month to assemble a team. Hitting back, the Building Safety Regulator said a high number of poor applications, with the industry not really understanding the process, had also added to the delays. Merely stating that regulations and standards have been met is insufficient. It must be proved, as making false claims was how we got into this mess in the first place. The Building Safety Regulator admitted that the model was not working as well as anticipated, and considered hiring dedicated technical experts in order to reduce delays. The government has promised to publish its response to the Grenfell inquiry on the 24th of March, although it has already been predicted it is unlikely that a single regulator for the entire construction industry will be introduced. And now, moving on. Measuring embodied carbon. The figures don't lie. The construction industry is a major source of carbon emissions, and urgent action is needed to reduce the amount of pollution. Everyone knows that quantity surveyors are good at knocking out schedules of materials and labour. Whether you subscribe to climate change theories or not, pressure is on the construction industry to reduce its carbon footprint, and some clients are asking the QS to quantify embodied carbon to enhance their green credentials, and in theory it sounds straightforward. The principle for calculating embodied carbon is to multiply the estimated quantity of each material or product by a carbon factor, normally measured in terms of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per square metre. However, unlike measuring quantities, there is no consistent application of the methodology on how to measure embodied carbon, and in addition, there is a lack of available consistent data. In October 2023, the BCIS launched the Building Environment Carbon Database, which is similar to the BCIS cost analysis data used for cost planning. The database is open access. However, the RICS admit it is far from perfect, and importantly, it is not an assessment tool. However, it's worth a look. As somebody who writes some blogs on current topics of interest to construction professionals, I am acutely aware that if, for example, I post an item on how to take off quantities, it'll receive a lot of hits, whereas if I post an item with the headline of carbon assessment, it's not exactly going to be blog of the week. So, what does that say about us? Even so, I raise the question of carbon accounting. It's no wonder the industry is cool about this topic. I recently joined an hour-long RICS BCIS webinar on measuring carbon. After a 20-minute live-in between the RICS president and the CEO of BCIS, what followed was, well, not very much really, apart from the admission by Justin Sullivan, president of the RICS, that the APC is going to change, and he's still searching for what to call quantity surveyors, even suggesting the old chestnut of building economist. So, what were the takeaways from the webinar? I suppose the main one was the admission by the CEO of the BCIS that carbon accounting market is like the Wild West and currently open to abuse, with no consistent unit of measurement, and the carbon data is in a mess. The RICS would like to see a greater use of whole life carbon assessment, in which the carbon impacts over the entire life cycle of a building asset from its construction through to its end of life are calculated. However, barriers to green development are at present substantial and include a lack of clear project goals, i.e. targets, lack of experience, skills and expertise, lack of commitment, although it should be pointed out that the Greater London Authority requires a whole life carbon assessment for larger projects, and if that's not enough, a complicated and expensive rating procedure. During the course of the webinar, various polls were taken to assess the views of the participants, 80% of which were QSs. In answer to the question, have you ever been asked to carry out a whole life cost assessment, 88% responded no. However, nearly 60% thought offering a whole life carbon assessment would enhance their services. What worries me is that it was difficult enough to get QSs and the industry to adopt the new rules of measurement suite, let alone another very complex process. Coming soon on Duncan Cartlidge Online, a presentation outlining the challenges in quantifying embodied and operational carbon. And finally, a cautionary tale about moths. In a widely reported case last week, the newly appointed president of the RICS, the same Justin Sullivan as in the previous item, was criticised by a High Court judge who was unimpressed with his grasp of the details in the case, where he was acting as an expert witness. In a nutshell, a very rich couple bought a £32 million mansion in Notting Hill, London. After moving in, they found the house was suffering from an infestation of moths, or as Inspector Clouseau would probably say, myths. Myths? Apparently, millions of moths were living and breeding in the natural wool insulation in the house, and falling onto the occupants and their children, and even landing in their Chardonnay. The RICS president became involved as an expert witness, advising on the cost of curing the moth problem by remedial work. If it were me, if I was buying a £33 million house, wouldn't you fork out a few more quid and have a home buyer's report? The 73-page judgment questions whether moths were vermin and whether this should have been flagged up on the seller's pre-sale inquiry. The judge stated, and I quote, "I was unimpressed by Mr. Sullivan's grasp of the matters in issue, which to a considerable degree I consider was work that he had done for him by his team, and with the detail of which he was insufficiently familiar. I was unimpressed by his exercise of judgment, which seemed to me to be flawed in many instances, and his approach to answering questions that were put to him." Now, I do have some sympathy for Justin Sullivan, as most probably what happened was the members of Sullivan's firm prepared the report and the estimate, and he didn't spend time to digest the minutiae, although clearly he should have. The judge went on, "With one exception, he was unwilling to make sensible concessions and consider, in an open way, whether his opinion should be qualified or corrected, and instead he argued with many questions and did not answer them." Now, there is a serious point to this, as the RICS warned its members last year about the dangers of acting as an expert witness in trials, saying that the risks posed to a surveyor whose expert evidence is criticised or dismissed cannot be overstated. Lawyers conducting cross-examination may use this fact to challenge the credibility of the expert witness in subsequent cases. The RICS went on to say, once a surveyor's reputation is tarnished, it is difficult, if not impossible, to restore. In this case, the sale was reversed on the grounds that the buyers were not aware of the problem when they purchased the house, and additionally, a considerable amount of reparations were also paid. Given the severity of the judge's criticism of the RICS president, one can only wonder what impact it will have for him personally and for the RICS. In any event, it is a cautionary tale about acting as expert witness. Well, that's all for this episode. I hope that you found this interesting. Thank you for listening to the end. This has been a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. Barney and I would really appreciate it if you were to spread the word, subscribe, and if you have time, write a review. Until next time, take care and mind those myths.